Okay, in this chapter, we're going to look at the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is important because what it does is it allows us to talk about the relationship between inflation and unemployment and this balancing act that has to be done between the two. Now, this trade-off only really exists in the short run. In the long run, this doesn't exist, largely because the long-run aggregate supply curve is completely vertical. Thus, there is no trade-off. Thus, and you're like, what, Scheiding? Why is that the case? Because if the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, that's the price level, real GDP, and again, unemployment is kind of implied in the real GDP. The unemployment rate is going to be stuck at the long run unemployment rate, the natural rate, and the price level can be wherever the aggregate demand curve is. As opposed to the short run, where the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Thus implying, now I can say the thus implying, is that the lower the price level, the higher the unemployment. Higher unemployment because the GDP is lower. The higher the prices, the lower the unemployment. That's the nature of the trade-off that we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Both of these figures, inflation, both of these statistics, inflation and unemployment, we look at them quite extensively in economics. We've already talked about how you measure these things. Both of these statistics are used to talk about how the economy is doing as a whole. And what you get is with the Phillips curve is you get this first discussion in 1958 of that trade-off that exists between the two, between inflation and unemployment. And what he did to describe that relationship is he looked at data from the UK between 1861 and 1957, and he found in that data a negative correlation between those two, meaning that when one went up, the other went down, and vice versa. And taking that further from the Phillips curve, then Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, what they did is they also showed that negative correlation between unemployment and the rate of inflation as a way to talk about how the Federal Reserve needed to be more proactive about controlling inflation. And what they did is they then presented Samuelson and Solow. It allowed it to be presented to policymakers at the Federal Reserve and in the federal government that they basically need to make a choice. What are they going to choose? They have to choose one or the other. But the power was they can choose one or the other. You then just have to decide which one is better to have, low inflation or low unemployment. But you can't have both. This is in essence what's being said in this chapter. So in a simple kind of graph here, it would be downward sloping with inflation on the y-axis and unemployment on the x-axis. When that's higher, that's lower, and vice versa. It's only in the short run. And again, it's the economy moving along the short run aggregate supply curve. Where you've got the price level on the y-axis and unemployment implicitly behind the real GDP on the x-axis. As you shift the aggregate demand curve, as you increase the aggregate demand curve, you then cause, because of the short run aggregate supply curve, you cause higher prices and also lower unemployment. Well, in essence, actually, I shouldn't go that way. It's really, you get both of those. When you decrease the aggregate demand curve, you get the opposite. So now you got to make that choice. Are the policymakers going to choose to do this? Or are they going to choose to do this? Are they going to increase aggregate demand or lower aggregate demand? That's going to determine whether they choose option 1 or option 2. I'm not sure if I need to repeat this graph, largely because I've just talked about it. But again, by shifting out the aggregate demand curve, the price level would go up. And unemployment would go down. And you would see unemployment going down as the price level goes up. That'd be a movement from A to B. Long run for the Phillips curve is not upward sloping. It's completely vertical. It's the unemployment rate is basically uncontrolled. It's at the natural rate, which is just determined by the resources and the natural technologies that you have in the economy. So policymakers have no control over unemployment in the long run. All they can control in the long run are prices. And you see that here. Option 1 in the long run. Option 2 in the long run is either high inflation or low inflation. But that's the same regardless. And that's in the long run. And that's reflected by the fact that the long run aggregate supply curve is also vertical. So nothing too surprising here. Hopefully. What that long run Phillips curve also then shows is it shows that monetary neutrality is there, remains. Again, that's our divergence between real and nominal variables. And in that, again, as you increase the money supply, you shift the AD to the right, the aggregate demand curve to the right. And as you shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, it does cause inflation. But again, no impact on the unemployment rate. And you would see that by increasing the aggregate demand curve, that the price level has increased, the real GDP has remained the same, meaning that the unemployment rate would be the same as well. And you could just look at this picture here, which is much nicer looking, but at least you get to see me making it. That was pretty exciting, right? Yeah, probably not, but still. it bears mentioning what it means to say that we have a natural rate of unemployment. It doesn't mean that it's zero. It doesn't mean that it's the rate that you want it to be. Rather, it's basically the um, natural frictions, the frictional unemployment plus the structural unemployment. Basically, this happens in any market economy, that um, there's always going to be some unemployment. It's going to be pretty low. Um, it's not going to be necessarily what society wants, but it's just the natural frictions that exist in having a market exist. Now, this natural rate of unemployment is also socially determined. By that we mean, if you've got pro employer policies that really don't put up a lot of roadblocks to hiring an employee, then employers will hire them quickly, because they know they can fire them easily, or because they don't have to pay them as much. And so that would make the natural rate of unemployment lower. In like Western Europe, where things are a bit more socialized in terms of the insurance programs that come with employment, and maybe unions are more prevalent, then the natural rate of unemployment would be a little bit higher, or maybe a lot higher. Again, you can engage in policies to try to reduce that natural rate of unemployment, and you would do that by anything that can shift the Phillips curve to the left, which basically would mean shifting the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. By shifting the long run aggregate supply curve to the right, you then therefore lower the unemployment rate by increasing the real GDP. Now, what a lot of this also depends on too is having some notion of what the expected inflation is. And agencies like the Federal Reserve need to take into account what these expectations are, so that they can then either meet those expectations, or they're going to have to prepare the market for the fact that these expectations are not going to be met. The biggest problems in the economy happen when things are unexpected. So then the Federal Reserve needs to do more to control this uncertainty in the market, and it can do this by telegraphing what it intends to do, but also it could start to try to meet those expectations, even if they don't necessarily believe in them. And they can do that by engaging in monetary policy. If they, for instance, if they increase the money supply, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve, and you're not going to see as much of a fluctuation in unemployment and prices. Now, in the long run, a lot of this isn't as relevant anymore, because it's actually only been in the past few years that the Federal Reserve has finally just said they're going to tell us what they're going to do in the long run. And we actually already know that the inflation rate in the United States is going to be between 2% and 2.25%. But that's the inflation target that they intend to meet over the long run. Now, in the long run, what we know is that we're not going to be able to adjust the unemployment rate, because we're not adjusting the real GDP, which then leaves our unemployment rate at the natural rate. So then you would have to engage in policies that reduce the natural rate of unemployment, by, for instance, making the labor market more efficient or inefficient, depending on what direction you want to shift the, what direction you want to move the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, I'm going to skip just a few things here because we don't need to do everything in this chapter. I'm not going to hold you responsible for this, or this, or that. Now, let's turn to the natural rate hypothesis. The idea here is that with the natural rate hypothesis is that unemployment will generally and eventually return back to its normal rate. So just leave the market alone. It doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, the economy will fix itself. And to some extent, you did see this in the late 1960s. The problem is that the Federal Reserve chairman at the time also pumped a lot of money into the economy, engaged in expansionary monetary policy to cover lots of government spending. And it caused the incredibly high inflation that existed in the 1970s. And that's what you see right here. That the money supply rose 13% a year, with the conclusion that inflation went up to 5 to 6% a year. Again, it's hard for me, based on the other lectures you saw of mine, it's hard for me to think that we're not entering a similar situation. So in the 1960s, you basically saw policymakers then making different choices along this downward sloping Phillips curve. And so you could have, I mean, I remember when I took my first principles of macroeconomics course, and I really do remember it. I mean, gosh, it must have been like 25 years ago that I took principles of macro for the first time. I still remember my professor, Roy Anderson, and Roy Anderson talking about this Phillips curve and basically saying that when he, Roy Anderson, old man, was a graduate student at around this time at the University of Illinois, you could have made an entire dissertation around exactly this topic about this policy choice that existed. That gets us through the 1960s. The problem is what happens in the 1970s. The problem was that inflation stayed high, but the unemployment was still towards the natural rate, giving us or breaking apart the trade-off. And that's where it all breaks down. See what happens in the 1970s? You start to get that stagflation, where you have a stagnant economy, or an economy that's just basically even slowly getting worse while you maintain the inflation. Now, we can also shift the Phillips curve. We can shift it by doing something that affects the firm's cost and that affects its prices. So you can try to adjust the economy. And the one thing that did happen in the 1970s that might have shifted the Phillips curve was the dramatic increase in oil prices that we saw that could then lead to that stagflation that we saw. So it's not necessarily the case that we would see that stagflation again. Essentially, the supply shock, like higher oil prices, would decrease the aggregate supply curve, thus increasing the Phillips curve. Although, don't dismiss that last sentence. You still have a Phillips curve. It's actually just a worse Phillips curve, because now the same unemployment rate is associated with a higher inflation rate, right? That comes from reading that vertically. At that same unemployment rate, let's say 5%, whereas you used to have that price, now you have that price, thus leaving most consumers worse off. And what the higher oil prices in essence did, as I just kind of said, is it shifted that supply curve and it shifted it to the right, as you saw right here. And so as you take the 1970s through that entire decade, you see a Phillips curve that is moving in a circle rather than the upward, downward trajectory. Because of the rampant inflation that existed in the 1970s, Paul Volcker was nominated by President Jimmy Carter to be the Federal Reserve Chairman. He took office in October of 79, and he basically dramatically increased interest rates to slow the economy down and forced the economy into a recession, which is exactly what he did, causing an incredibly severe recession in 1981-82. That's where we saw that one unemployment rate, the highest it's been since the Great Depression. And that is exactly what we saw. That basically Volcker intentionally cooled the economy down dramatically in order to lower the inflation rate. Now, if we do nothing, basically the economy could end up fixing itself. If we start out at A and the economy starts to contract, then we would travel along that aggregate demand curve. But what if, again, the Volcker idea would be, let's not wait for that painful process to happen where more and more people are slowly losing their jobs. Let's go from A and just go straight to C. And we're going to do that by decreasing the Phillips curve, which means in this case, reducing the aggregate demand. So what's the sacrifice ratio then that exists in the United States economy? So what the sacrifice ratio tells us is it tells us how much do I have to sacrifice real GDP to reduce inflation by 1%. Look at that number. That is not insignificant. I have to reduce the economy by 5% to reduce prices by 1%. Inflation is an incredibly stubborn problem to get rid of once you've got it. And that's my concern generally for the future. Now, when we think about inflation as well, we need to consider the fact that people are rational. And by that, I mean, taxpayers would know that all bills eventually have to get paid. So if the government's borrowing a lot of money to pay for stimulus, let's say, then they're not going to spend their own money as much because they know that in the future, they're going to get stuck with this higher tax bill to pay for all the stimulus that happened at a different point in time. Now, it might be possible to create costless disinflation, but this is pretty difficult to do because the government basically has to be known for being committed to low inflation. And generally speaking, most governments in the world have a pretty bad reputation for being able to control inflation. And the reason why that is because it's difficult to get reelected by cooling an economy down, which is what you have to do to again achieve that lower inflation. So the peak inflation during the Volcker administration of the Federal Reserve, that peak inflation was 10% with a sacrifice ratio of 5. Then you basically have to reduce the economy a great deal, well, by a factor of 5 to achieve that. Now, you're not going to do that all at once, because what you're also going to do is you're going to change people's expectations. And in a few short years, by 1984, the inflation rate was down to 4%. Now, there was a pretty high recession during the 1981 to 1982, an incredibly deep recession, a scarring recession. It's certainly the first recession I ever remember, and it seemed pretty scary back then. And I was only 5 years old, 6 years old, 5 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. Yeah, and maybe I knew I should have become an economist if I'm remembering recessions, and I'm only 4 years old, but it was pretty bad. And look at what Volcker does then to the Phillips curve. Starts to round it out again. Gets us that lower inflation rate along with some lower unemployment. I'm just trying to think here, what do I still want to do? I don't need to do that. Let's look at Greenspan here very briefly. So Greenspan takes over after Paul Volcker, and he takes on the role of the chair of the Federal Reserve in 1987, actually right before the stock market crash in 1987. Now, he was helped by a favorable supply shock, which actually led to a fall in prices further as oil prices decreased. That in turn also led to unemployment falling. It helped get George Bush the first elected into office after Reagan stepped down. But then eventually what it did is it caused a very minor recession in 1991 after a period of high inflation that started to occur, which then led to Bill Clinton winning office in 1992. In general, Alan Greenspan was an easy money kind of guy. He liked to pump the money with the economy. He incredibly closely followed the Taylor rule in terms of how the money supply was determined. And what that did is it led the markets to be able to closely predict what was happening. He met the 2001 recession pretty aggressively. I was with the Federal Reserve at that time. He met that pretty aggressively, and he basically engaged in dramatic expansionary monetary policy to reduce the size of that recession, which again led to the housing crisis by 2008. By 2005, unemployment was pretty darn close to its natural rate. And so if you look at the Greenspan administration, in general, what you should notice here is the tightness of the disparity, meaning you don't have a lot of fluctuations in either unemployment or inflation. It's kind of like a blob. Now, the defining feature since then, essentially, starting with Ben Bernanke, it's all been about crises and how do you resolve those crises. And you see part of that with again, the housing market, where between 1995 and 2006, housing prices had doubled. But then by 2006 to 2009, housing prices fell by a third. Households, their wealth levels decreased, and as a result, they spend less. And also, it really affected financial markets, and it made banks less willing to lend money out. And so, as a result, the unemployment rate went from its natural rate in 2005 to close to 10% by 2010. But even though the unemployment rate's going up, then the inflation rate's going down, and it does fall further from 3% to 1%. Now, if there's any regrets that Obama and even Ben Bernanke have about the financial crisis, it's that they should have done more. If you think about it, all the controversy during the 2008-2009 crisis was around a stimulus plan that cost $785 billion with a B dollars. This latest round of stimulus, round 3 of stimulus for the COVID stimulus, was $1.9 trillion. That's more than double in this third round what was done in the only round during the 2008-2009 crisis. And so because there wasn't enough stimulus during the 2008-2009 crisis, the recovery was slow. So it was a 5-year long recovery that took till 2015 to get the unemployment rate back to the natural rate and keeping inflation low. By 2018, under Janet Yellen, you did actually have to start to engage in contractionary monetary policy. And for the most part, the number here you should be focusing on here that you're seeing multiple times is that one thing that does emerge from the financial crisis is that the government then does start to, not the government, the Federal Reserve then does start to state its policy of working towards a 2% inflation rate target. And so you see, as you look at 2008, 2009, again, you see incredibly low levels of inflation. But again, a rather tight bound in terms of inflation. The disparity you see is all in terms of the unemployment rate. Okay.